Hi everyone, this video is for Tiago in Germany, and he asked me about crossover rebuild for a Dynaudio x14 speaker. And actually here I'm going to present a few options and ideas, and basically there will be two paths: play it safe or make a deep dive. So if you play it safe, then the results will be more controlled, but the gains will be much less. And if you want to go full extent, then you can really upgrade the speakers tremendously. But it might be a longer road, so you can be prepared for maybe you will need to do some adjustments. So this is the Dynaudio x14 speaker, and it's a really nice bookshelf, and it's a really compact size, and you don't see it, but the woofer unit and the tweeter are really nicely done. They have really solid magnet structures behind them, and do not worry that they have aluminum voice coil. The aluminum voice coil is so companies use that sometimes because aluminum is much lighter than copper, so you can make a moving structure. The moving mass of your driver is much lower compared to using copper, but you cannot do anything about that. You cannot change it, so that's how it is. And just work around with the internal wires, with speaker cables and so on. So Stereophile did measurements on the impedance and the frequency range. So when we look at the impedance, we see that it does not dip below about 6.2 ohms or so. So it's really amplifier friendly. And when you are looking at the crossover region between woofer and tweeter, it's this big peak here, that impedance peak with the solid black line that shows where your woofer is crossing over to your tweeter. And the phase response, that's the dotted line here, where it crosses 0, you see, that's the point where this will be highest. It's not shown here on the measurement where is the peak, but the peak will be very close to where you see the crossing at 0 for the phase, for the impedance phase response. So that crosses at around 1.8 kilohertz, which is a really low crossover frequency for the tweeter. And actually Stereophile mentions it too, that this 1-inch dome tweeter goes very low compared to most dome tweeters of that size, and that's actually a really good news. And when you have a look at the motor structure of this tweeter, it's really beefy. So this speaker uses advantage of that fact that the tweeter goes lower than most tweeters go, so they can cross over the woofer at a lower frequency, and that gives an opportunity for that woofer to put out more at lower frequencies. So when you think about woofers, one of the factors that determine how much energy can they output, how much low frequency can they produce, is their size, their diameter. But if you have like the exact same woofer, depending on how you use that woofer, it can have drastically different output. So if you have your woofer and you cross it over around 1.8 kilohertz, so you are already starting to limit the frequency response around 1 kilohertz of that woofer, then your woofer really has to take care of this region which is below 1 kilohertz. But if you have a tweeter which is not as good as this Dynaudio tweeter, and it's crossed at 2.5 kilohertz, maybe a little higher, then your woofer might need to work up to 2 kilohertz. So and if that doesn't seem too much, like, right, 1 kilohertz, 2 kilohertz, who cares? Actually, it's a lot of difference. between 1 kilohertz and 2 kilohertz, it's a whole octave. So it means that in that case, if we had a wimpy average tweeter, then our woofer would need to go 1 octave higher. And that's a really severe demand on a driver to go 1 octave more than it wants to go. And in this case, this woofer could easily go to 2 kilohertz. That would be not a problem. But in that case, this lower response, the low frequency response, would suffer because it's making a lot of higher frequency movements. That prohibits it from making those low frequency movements as well. So, and that's because it can handle only a certain amount of energy, and that energy is either at a lower range or a higher range. So I think this fact that the tweeter can go much lower than usual tweeters in usual, that is one of the reasons why this cabinet, despite that tiny size, can go to pretty low. And if you think about like big speakers and you're thinking how low can it get, let me see. So this phase here, this impedance peak, it goes up. That shows here, that's the self-resonant frequency of the woofer, and that impedance peak is there because the driver wants to resonate at that frequency. So it's harder to control it at that region. That's why the impedance rises there. And if we go lower in frequency, then we are past the resonant frequency of the driver, so it gets easier to control. And the self-resonant frequency of the driver, if it's not in the cabinet, is much lower than that, because you see here the resonant frequency is around 80 hertz. That's pretty high, but that's normal for a woofer this size. Even bigger size cabinets can have. So for example, I have a Soundcraftsman Lancer speakers, which is a horn upper frequencies and a 12-inch woofer in a passive radiator cabinet with a 12-inch passive radiator in it, and there the self-resonant frequency is also around 80 hertz. I think maybe it's even higher. So do not think too much that it's at a too high frequency, because it doesn't really matter. In that case of that Lancer speakers, that goes down to even to high 20s. It's really strong, down to 30s. So that where the resonance occurs does not really give you that much clue on how low your speaker can get, but so for most speakers it will be around the 70 to 90 hertz region. But this will also show you that once you go below that frequency, that's where the port starts to work. So when you, let's just show with green, this valley here, you see here, this valley shows that frequency range where your port is getting stronger and stronger, and its peak output is here at 55 hertz. So that's the port tuning, and that's how you can tell that your driver is or that your port is tuned to that frequency, because it has the lowest impedance at that point. And it has the lowest impedance there because that's where the speaker cone, the driver cone, has to move the least to create the sound pressure for that frequency. So when you look how much your driver has to move to create the sound pressure at that frequency, when you go higher with the peak, the more the excursion will be, and as you go down this peak, the excursion will be less and less and less. So at 55 hertz, your driver cone will move just a tiny bit to produce the same level, same sound pressure level that it produces at 80 hertz. And the difference is so drastic that it might be like 4 or 5 times less than it works at 100 hertz. So this is where at around 50 hertz, this is where the driver is really comfy to work with. Around 80 hertz, this is where it's not so comfy. But that's not a big problem, because amplifiers can handle the 80 hertz region easily. When you go lower in the frequency, like right here, when you have that second peak, which is around 30 hertz, 32, 35, something like that, we do not see where the peak ends. It goes above the maximum 20 ohms in this figure, and that one is the tougher thing for amplifiers, because at that frequency range, like low 30s, 20s, that's where the amp starts to run into difficulties. So that's also an indication for you which is the absolute lowest frequency that your speakers will be working with. So you can expect output from these speakers down to about 35 hertz. When you look at this, like a 20, this is 30 hertz, 40. So I would say like at 40 hertz here, this is the line. So it's around the 15 ohm, 14.5 ohms impedance. It is reached around that point, and it's pretty close to the port cutoff. So I would say that these speakers have an output down to 40 hertz, and they are really happy down to 50 hertz. So actually they will have a nice output in the low frequency despite their tiny size. And if you think, oh, 50 hertz is not so much, 40 hertz is not that good, just think about that we are talking about a really small, really compact speakers, and for them to produce low frequencies is much harder than for a big speaker. And do not worry about this too much, because they compensate this missing of the very low frequencies by having a much more precise imaging for that range, which is most of our hearing range. Because don't forget, most of the music that our brain processes is between 500 hertz to 16 kilohertz. So if you have this region covered and it's pick and span, it's perfect, then that's your cake. The rest is the icing on the cake. And people usually focus too much on the icing, and I hear a lot of whining that my speakers just go to 40 hertz and really need to go down to 20. That's just the icing. You really need to worry first about having this region right. Because even though if you add the sub and it goes down to 20 hertz, maybe 16 hertz, but if you do not have this region perfectly covered, it will sound pretty bad. In this case, we have this region really well covered. The drivers are located as close to each other as possible, so they give a really nice pinpoint imaging that's just perfect for even for like a near field listening or low volume listening, and then you can really enjoy the presentation they give. And when we are upgrading the crossover, let's see what will change with this. So the changes will be this peak will be a little bit different, because when you change your crossover components, you will likely change the crossover region as well, and there is no prediction about this, how it will affect the crossover, but I will make certain recommendations here, and to see that when we do something, it will have a tendency to have a certain effect, and I will also tell how to adjust for things. The port tuning frequency, that will not be changed by changing the parts, that could be only changed by changing the port length, the port diameter, or the volume of the cabinet. As Tiago, you are moving the crossovers outboard from outside the cabinet, that will give a little extra volume for the cabinet. So actually your port tuning will be maybe a hertz lower than what it was before. It will not be a noticeable difference, a big difference, but it will be a tiny difference in a good direction. So your speakers will have, by moving the crossover outboard, it will have a little bit more bottom end, but just a tiny bit. But it's better to have a tiny bit better than tiny bit worse, right? Okay, so let's have a look at the crossover itself. So on the underside of the crossover we have the resistors. These are the original ones. These are non-inductive ceramic resistors. So on the inside you have wire coils, and they are non-inductive because half of the coil is coiled one direction, like clockwise, and the second half is counterclockwise. So inductance towards one direction, and then counter inductance other direction, and the net result is 0. So this is not the same zero inductance as you have with film resistors, because there is still a smear. So there is maybe like a couple microhenries smear, and then you reverse it by going the other way around, but the smear already happened. The net inductance is 0, but they do take away information because the inside is still inductive. And I have used these resistors a lot, and for example, even people like to use them for Zobel networks to correct the load of the driver that it presents to your amp, and to adjust the frequency response. But what I found that whenever I made a Zobel network with these on my single driver void pipe, so it's just one driver only, so it's very clear whatever modification, whatever change you induce with even just a single part, none of the Zobel networks work, because these resistors, they just kill the sound. So they take away the life from the sound. So I cannot recommend them. And whenever I see any crossover, changing these resistors to a film resistor, any kind of film resistor, will make a huge change. It will bring a lot of musicality to your speaker. So these resistors are really good, that they keep the sound very controlled. So you have a kind of like, okay, every parameter is controlled, it sounds right, but it doesn't really sound like music. That's the feeling that these resistors give to the sound. And when you change them to a film resistor, you can either use a thin film or thick film. Higher wattage film resistors are usually thick film resistors, and people really love the thin film. But if you want like a 20 watt rated or 50 watt rated film resistor, you cannot find a thin film resistor at that wattage, or if you find, it's extremely expensive. And the thick film resistors are still also very high quality, and one of my favorites are the CADOC thick film resistors. They break in quite fast, and they do not contribute a strong character to the sound. That they really kind of stay outside of the playing field, and they let the musicality come through. So they are I like them a lot. And in the case because these film resistors, like either the CADOC, or if you cannot find CADOCs, try to look for Vichy or Borns. All of them make these film resistors, and these thick film resistors will look like they will almost look like a transistor with two legs. They look like that, and they need a heatsink to work if you are using them at their full wattage rating. You can get by without a heatsink, so what I do is I just get, there are those copper tapes, which are the self-adhesive copper tape that you can peel it off from a paper and you can stick it on to surfaces. So I just peel off a piece of sticky copper tape, let's say this is my copper tape, and tape it around from both sides and create extra wings for your resistor so it has a bigger surface to dissipate the heat. And that's what the heat sinks do, they give an additional surface. And do not be worried about the fact that how big your heatsink is. Just make sure that you get the biggest wattage film resistor you can. So for example, here these resistors were, I think, what were they, 10 watt? Yes, they were 10 watt rated resistors, so I would change them with 50 watt rated CADOC or any other film resistor, and just take a piece of copper tape, or even if you go for a 50 watt, then you don't even need that copper tape for it. You can leave them bare without heatsink, because you have overrated them a lot. So the thing with resistor rating is that when resistors drop voltage, they produce heat. And if you run like a 2-3 watt power through a 50 watt rated resistor, it will produce very little heat. However, if you want to run 50 watt through a film resistor without any heat sink, then the whole thing will blow up really fast. But if you keep it under 10 watts, then it will not be an issue. And here these 10 watt resistors, so usually the wattage that the speakers manufacturer used in their crossover is already overrating, so it's higher wattage than necessary in that situation. So if you go like a 5 times higher rating for a film resistor, you will be very safe, even if you have minimal heat sinking for it. Another brand that I haven't mentioned that is Coaspare, and Coaspare, they make carbon film resistors. And the only problem with them, you cannot get them in big sizes. They go up to 5 watt rating. So if you can find 2, 3 or 5, so they have 2, 3 and 5 watts. So here this guy here is a 5 watt rated resistor. So if you can find a 5 watt carbon film Coaspare, you can plug it in there. Or these are 2 watts rated. You can change these with coas as well. The coas, they need a long time to break in, but once they break in, they have a very nice, very musical sound, close to the CADOC films when you use them in a crossover. And the advantage of the CADOCs is that they take, or you can use Borns as well, or Vichy, they break in super fast. So you plug them in, let them run for an hour, 2 hours, you get the idea how they will sound a year, 2 years later. The only change will be that they will be more precise sounding, you will have more and more detail. But the coas, when you stick them on, they sound really dead and really slow, and it takes them like at least a month or 2 months to break them in. But once they break in, they will be as good as a CADOC in a speaker crossover. So I think those are the consideration for resistors. And one more thing that you mentioned to me, that you didn't find a source for CADOC in Germany. There's this online store called Mauser Electronics, and I found that they have a Mauser Europe section. So try to find try to log into Mauser Europe, because Mauser has film resistors. They have a really wide selection of them. They also have coax pair, but I think they are not carrying the 5 watters anymore, and even the 2 watters, it's very rare they carry them. And so this is how those film resistors look like. And eventually I would recommend these over the Mills resistors, because I have found that film resistors are by far the best for crossover. So if you want to do a serious rebuild, then use a film resistor. And you see they look, even Omite has film resistors. So if you can find Cadog, that's the best, but you can go for others as well, as long as it's a film resistor. And just try to keep the value as close to original as possible. And I would say that before you buy these resistors, measure the resistors on the circuit board, what is their exact value, because for example the tolerances for those non-inductive resistors, those white ones, it's not as good, and you might want to have an exact look what was the exact value, just to have a baseline from which you want to change. Let's see. And when we look at here at the other side of the crossover board, now we have the capacitors here and the inductors. And these ones, the Bannick, I really have zero preference for these caps. They don't do anything good to the sound. In every speaker I upgraded the crossover. Changing the Bannick caps it just gives you tremendous upgrade. It's like going from 0 to 100, kind of that sort of feel. This cap here, that it's a better than those yellow ones, but I would recommend to get rid of the yellow ones for sure. You mentioned that there was that comment of that person who put, I think, the Jensen cap instead of this 15 microfarad Bannick, and he had troubles with it. And he had problems with it because you see the original, it says 15 microfarad, but when he actually measured his on board, the actual value of the cap was 16.1 microfarad, so it was higher value, and he changed it for a much higher quality and lower value 15 microfarad Jensen cap. And the thing with that is that it will make it much thinner and harsher sounding, and that's because if you upgrade a capacitor for a higher grade, then it will let much higher frequency energy through than your old cap did. So you need to increase the capacitance compared to the original cap to keep the same character of your speakers, and he did the exact opposite unknowingly. So that he went lower with the capacitance and higher with the quality. So basically it was a similar effect as if he has changed his Bannick cap from a 16.1 microfarad maybe to a 12 microfarad cap. So probably if he was to try that out, to take out his cap and put in a 12 microfarad of the same brand, same kind of capacitor, he would have the same type of nervous sound that he experienced with that 15 microfarad higher quality capacitor. So for that position, I would recommend going to a higher value, going for an 18, so 1/8 microfarad for that position. And I would recommend to start with the Mundorf EVO oils, so get that for all of the caps. And the good thing is that the EVO oils are quite musical sounding, and they have a neutral character, so they will not push the sound toward any kind of unwanted or extreme behavior. So they are not extremist capacitors. Like for example, if you were to get Solans, the Solans give tremendous extreme high energies, and their low energy is non-existent. So for example, if you have speakers where you want more high frequency energy and more high frequency extension, and you are feeling that you are not getting enough high frequency, then for the high pass crossover that feeds your tweeter, try changing a cap for a Solan, and that you will hear almost like adding a super tweeter to the sound, but it might probably destroy your mid bass as well, because what people usually don't realize is that the lower region of your tweeter going under 2 kilohertz, that contributes a lot to how you experience mid bass. So if the 500 hertz to 2 kilohertz region is lacking, then your mid bass will be very thin, even though you might have the 100 hertz gigantic peak, 200 hertz overblown. If you have 500 to 2K skinny, then when you hear a drum snap, it will be just a colorless, there will be no impact and speed. So for drums, when there's a drum kick, then the body of that drum kick will be provided by the low frequencies, which reside under 400 hertz, but the snap, the impact that it's coming to you at great speed, that is produced by the 500 hertz to 2 kilohertz region. And people usually just want to, if they do not have speed for their drums, they want to add the subwoofer to make it better, but it will just make it worse because it adds muddiness. If you do not have the sub dialed in 100% right, it will just muddy up the sound. But even if you have it dialed perfectly, you will be still lacking that 500 hertz to 2 kilohertz range, so you still won't get the speed for your drums. Your drums will sound bigger because you have the low frequencies aligned up, but you still won't get the speed. So getting that speed right, it happens when you have your tweeter's high pass filter dialed in well. And I think for that here I cannot see actually what is what, but I suspect that this region here, so this is your high pass filter, and I suspect that this is a third order filter. So there's a capacitor and an inductor and another capacitor, so 1 cap, 2 cap, and an inductor in the middle. So that's your network for high pass. And for the low pass, it would be this inductor and possibly this capacitor, and I'm not sure what this is doing. Maybe it's it could be that it might be in the high pass filter, and because there's a couple extra resistor on the backside, so at least one of these capacitors is used as an equalization, as a network equalization filter to cut a certain frequency band more than than just the slope of the pass filter would. So, but definitively the low pass is second order, so you have only one coil and one of these caps, possibly the bigger cap. These are the ones that contribute to your woofer's sound. And I would say that try EVO oil first for all of them, and I say that do not go for the Supreme right away, because you want to see first what these upgrades do to your high frequency capability of your tweeter. So I am not familiar with the sound of that tweeter, and if you put in like subprims or higher grade caps, you might overdo it, and you can make the sound of your speaker much harsher than you want. Just go for the same type of cap for both bass and tweeter, and that will give a nice balance to the sound. So it won't feel like there's two different kind of drivers producing the sound. They will mix in really nice together. And those Mundorf inductors you mentioned, they will be a good choice to complement them. And I would say that try to keep the same inductance for the inductors, but for the DCR, do not try to keep the same DCR. Go as low as you can get. Because for the woofer, if you go lower with the DCR, then you will get much more bass. And under much more bass, I mean much faster bass. The extension will be somewhat lower as well, so maybe if right now you are getting good until like 50 Hertz, you will be getting maybe down to 45 Hertz, or maybe even a little lower, strong bass. But the real difference will be that it will fill with much greater speed, much greater authority, and it will be much more alive. It's kind of like energy going into the bass. And the higher DCR an inductor coil has, it just chokes it down. It doesn't let the energy through. So you want as high, as low DCR, as high gauge, so as thick wires as possible. However, the lower the DCR of your coil, the more energy it will let through, and not just at the range which belongs to the crossover slope, but it will affect your crossover as well. So you will hear higher. So right now it's crossing over at 1 kilohertz, and if you make it to half a DCR, it will probably go up at least 200 hertz or more. So you have to compensate it by either you make the inductance higher, so go with 20% higher inductance. So if it's, let's say, like a 5 millihenry inductor, then go for a 6 millihenry instead. And yes, it will take a long while for it to break in, and while it breaks in, it's probably at least 1, maybe 2 or 3 months. For that time, it will feel that the mid-range and mid-bass will be anemic, but don't give up. If it sounds perfect right away, then it means that by the time it breaks in, it will be too harsh and unbearable by the time it's broken in, probably. But when you start and it like the mid-bass, mid-range is a little bit quieter, it lacks a little bit of energy or maybe a lot of energy, don't worry about that, don't freak out, because it will break in and it will sound normal. And for this capacitor down here, change it to an 18 microfarad EVO. This 12 microfarad, keep it at 12. What was this? I think 4.5 microfarad. I would say keep it at 4.5, and whatever this was, I think this was a really tiny one, keep it same value. But for this coil, add like 20% more, 10 to 20% more to the value that it has. And if you do these things, these value changes will compensate for upgrading the quality of these parts, and 2, for upgrading your internal wiring and your connectors. And let's go for the internal wiring. So you said to try out that gauge 16 OFC copper, the Neotech wires. I would suggest to add gauge 20 in parallel as well for your tweeter. So let's see, like this is your tweeter. So for one run, have a 16 gauge plus a 20 gauge, and for the other also have a 20 gauge and a 16 gauge. And for your woofer, on the positive leg of your woofer, add a 16 gauge plus a 20 gauge, like same as for your tweeter, but for the negative leg, which is the ground leg, add 2 times 16 gauge, so make that heavier gauge. So that will allow your woofer to have some more energy. And if there's space to add and it can be soldered on, then maybe you can go like 3 times for the negative leg, so like 3 times 16 gauge on the negative and 2 times 16 gauge plus a 20 gauge for the positive. And so just go as heavy as you can and add more onto the negative leg, and add a thin 20 gauge bypass onto the positive leg to give more texture, and the negative leg beefiness adds more drive, more oomph to it. And when you add these wires, make sure to have your technician twist them in pairs. So let's see, like twist these two guys together and twist them clockwise. Do not twist anti-clockwise, because when you twist them clockwise, they induce current in the other wires. So they will add up their energies and they will be faster, more dynamic. If they are twisted counterclockwise, then they will slow down the electricity in each other. So by making clockwise twist, you are making it more alive, more dynamic. Anti-clockwise twist takes out the life from it. And it's important to make sure to use a consistent wire orientation. So when you have your spool of cable, as your technician is cutting off the pieces of wires, just make sure that, like, let's say like this is the spool here, that when he cuts off a piece, then mark one end that was the leading end, and then mark the same end at the coil, so that when you connect the wires for the 2 speaker channels, use them in the same orientation, because copper is orientation sensitive. So if you flip one wire, it will have different sound than the other orientation. And you never know which will be the better orientation until you try it out. But if you do not keep it consistent for the 2 channels, you will have no idea what is going wrong with your speakers, and it can mess up the imaging, especially like here you have a really precise imaging speakers and you like to listen to them like a more near field scenario. You will notice if the wires are not properly oriented. So just keep it consistent for all of them. And if you want to increase the low level resolution, then I would really strongly recommend to have that gauge 20 wire that you parallel them with made from silver. And you cannot really get silver which has an insulation on it, or if you can get it, it's unrealistically expensive. So just get a silver wire from a jewelry supplier or fine metal supplier. Like for example here I get it from Rio Grande supplies, and Rio Grande is really good with consistency, and they have fine silver. So fine silver is the 3N, which is like 99.9% pure. And the most important thing with silver, because you notice that some people say that like for example Audionaut uses a good kind of silver, and a lot of other companies, the silver sounds harsh and brittle. So silver sounds harsh and brittle when it's not soft anneal. So the hard anneal silvers, they have this harsh and brittle sound, and Rio Grande, they have dead soft anneal silver. So if you can find dead soft anneal silver, get that. If you cannot find that, go for soft anneal. If it's hard, then do not get that. Then just go for a gauge 20 copper. So get this gauge 20 silver wire, get heat shrink tubing, and just put it in heat shrink tubing or Teflon tubing if you can find, but that will be more expensive. And of course, for the better capacitors, now I really messed it up here. I mentioned that to increase their value, do not increase the value of all of your capacitors because you can easily overshoot it. So just first try that out, that only that cap which is labeled as the 15 microfarad, get an 18 microfarad instead of that. And for the chokes, for the inductors, get 20% higher inductance. But before you decide, just shoot a message to me just to confirm what you have, what your exact values are, and what DCRs you have found, and I will confirm that for you whether it's the right choice or not. So basically these were my recommendations on how to rebuild it. And so if you want, you can try out the Mundorf Supremes or go higher grades, but I would say that at this point it's just too much of a change at once, and you don't know how they will react to it. So right now my best advice would be just to keep the capacitors uniform, like the same sonic signature, and then you will be able to tell as it breaks in, because after the crossover modifications are done, it can take a long time to break in. So for my ATEX speakers, when I changed the big inductor, the 10 millihenry inductor, that took half a year to break in, and during that half year it just massively changed. So like I had to redesign the whole crossover. So that's why after you have the entire thing running, and especially the Mundorfs, the EVOs, they also take a long while to break in, and until they break in they sound more closed in and more reserved, but they will open up really nicely. And initially they do not have any bass. It looks like you are lacking bass, but when they break in, it's like, wow, this is amazing. And the big change from Benic to the Evo oils would be that with Benic you hear bass, you hear treble, and with the Mundorf you do not hear high frequencies, you do not hear low frequencies, but you will start to hear instruments. So at first your ear will think that, ooh, the high extension is gone, the speaker doesn't extend as high as it did before. But once your ear starts to adapt, you will realize that it's a lot of high frequency distortion that's coming from the sound, and it sounds more as an instrument and more like instruments playing instead of frequency bands. So that's a jump that will happen once you upgrade your crossovers. So good luck, and good luck. No, not that you need much luck for this. It will work and you will enjoy it tremendously. Bye bye.